USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Week in Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to USCHO's Weekend Review podcast, being recorded on Tuesday, December 31st, 2019. I'm Ed Trefzger, along with our guest host this week, Dan Rubin, sitting in for Jim Connolly, who's on assignment. He's been covering some things, covered the Arizona State and Harvard games, and was going to cover the tournament in Las Vegas this coming weekend. So, Dan, I'm glad you could join us. It's a light schedule, but some interesting games as we look at tournaments. And the GLI is still going on as we record. But why don't we hop in and look at some of the tournaments that went on? 3 tournaments in the books, and the host team won all 3 of them. Let's start with the Mariucci tournament. It had its rebirth last year and a championship for Minnesota. Before we talk about Minnesota, though, how about St. Cloud, a 7-2 drubbing over then number 2 Minnesota State?
Yeah, that probably didn't feel too good out there in Mankato. St. Cloud I have not had good feelings about St. Cloud. I feel like it's been an Atlantic hockey hangover finally for them this year. And that was a big win for them, 7-2, 4 second period goals. And I think they hit on almost 25% of all their shots that they took. So, credit them. It's a good team they beat too. And maybe this gets them going, maybe supercharges the second half of the year for them.
And for Minnesota, they have been kind of off to a slow start. And I know fans are getting really antsy there. Minnesota State came back to beat Bemidji 2-0 in the consolation game, but a pretty solid 4-1 win for St. Cloud, or for Minnesota over St. Cloud on Sunday.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit of a pedestrian first period. There wasn't a whole lot of anything to speak of, at least when I was glancing down the stat sheet, reviewing some highlights. It wasn't a great first period, but then Minnesota hit the switch in the second period. They scored 3 times in 2 minutes, I think it was, and just pulled away after that. So you got to get those goals in bunches, and it stresses. I know everybody hates hearing it. Every coach says it, the 60 minutes, you got to play 60 minutes. And even though St. Cloud hung with Minnesota both before and after that stretch, it was a good vibe for Minnesota to win the host tournament in the Mariucci and get their second half moving, especially after the slow pedestrian first half that they had.
And for Bob Motzko, we got to remember he's been there a season and a half and actually took the reins of the program fairly late in the summer before he did. It really takes more than a couple of seasons to start to put your imprint on a program.
Yeah, very much so, especially with the way the recruiting cycle works and in hockey of how it's so unique and different with the junior hockey system. And it's good to see him get his stamp and start adding to his resume there.
The other 2 tournaments that took place over the weekend, both were predetermined matchups. I understand why they do it. I don't really like it that much, but I know you want to make sure you get the right teams on your schedule. Let's talk the Ledyard Bank tournament. Dartmouth, Bob Gaudette, one of the great guys in college hockey, and the Dartmouth men's hockey Twitter account, the best Twitter account in college hockey, bar none. But it was a championship in that for the Big Green. And as they've pointed out, teams that win that tournament go on and do great things. But Dartmouth winning that tournament, and that coming off of a few weeks before putting the first blemish on the schedule for Cornell, a pretty good start to the season for the Big Green.
Yes. I've been up there for the Ledyard Bank, actually, with Brown a number of years ago. Despite the predetermined matchups, I actually really enjoy the vibe of the entire tournament, the way that Dartmouth puts it on. Bob Gaudette is very proud of that tournament and that it keeps going with competitive matchups. And this year for Dartmouth, I like Dartmouth as a team. I love Bob Gaudette as a coach. I love him as a human being too. But I've been really excited and really enthusiastic about Dartmouth this year. A little bit bullish on where I think they can go as an ECAC team, and to see them come from behind to beat UConn. They were down 3-1 in the third period. They had given up those 2 goals, and to see them chip away at it, get the power play goal at the halfway point, and then score late in the period, but not late enough that it was a freaky goal that really cost UConn, like one of those last 10-second goals. It was still with enough time that UConn was able to come forward and start pressing and pull the goalie at the end of the game. It was really great for Dartmouth and kind of validates my feeling of them. The less number of games, they're still 6-4-2. I think they're hanging around a little bit in the pairwise a little bit more than some teams might think it might be there for a team that's only 2 games over 500. But I'm expecting some good things out of Dartmouth. I'm excited for them. And like I said, I think that this is a team that I'm bullish on going into the second half of the year.
It really is anybody's playoffs in the ECAC, especially if you get home ice in the first round or even that first round bye. Teams are able to sneak into the semifinals pretty well in the ECAC. So I think that will continue to be up for grabs for a dark horse or two late in the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that conference, it is I find ECAC to be one of the better conferences in college hockey in general. I would put it against the top tier of that league against anybody, anywhere on any rink. Dartmouth is tied for 5th. They're tied with Quinnipiac. They could very easily in the second half. There's not a lot of separation, even from Cornell down to 5th. So I would keep an eye on them. I know everyone loves Quinnipiac for obvious reasons. They're a team that has a little bit more of the established name with the 20-win seasons. But Dartmouth is one of those teams that, should Colgate falter, because Colgate's kind of playing above they're punching above their weight class based on what happened in non-conference play. I could see Dartmouth not only sneak into that, but also do some pretty good damage depending on what they get for a matchup moving forward.
The Catamount Cup saw the home Vermont squad win that one at Gutterson Fieldhouse. I've been to that tournament before, and what a great atmosphere at the Gut. The Catamounts have had a tough season, but a couple of 2-0 victories, 1-0 with empty netters both nights, meant that they were the only team to go 2-0 in that tournament. They came away with the win. Good job for Union, which has had a tough season so far, to get the 1-1 tie with Providence. But, in what is a difficult year for the Catamounts, a nice win in that tournament.
Yeah, and they had to hold on in that game against Lake Superior because they were playing that game. And when I say hold on, it was a 1-0 game the entire game. It was Ace Cowan scored late in the first period, and anytime I get a chance to mention Ace Cowens, I do. I remember that his name is Ace, and he wears number 14 for Garnet Ace Bailey. So that is just always something that I try to remember because I've seen Vermont through the last couple of seasons. But game didn't really devolve over the next second and third period. But anytime you can essentially win a 1-0 game and you get that empty net goal, you're feeling good. And for the fact that Vermont has seen its struggles this year, that was only their 3rd win. I know when you're dealing with that it's that the 1-win start, a couple of ties in there, but some disappointing finishes. The shutouts against BC and BU are disappointing. The shutout to Quinnipiac was disappointing. Giving up 7 goals to UConn is disappointing, not to rehash everything for Vermont fans. But to come out, win a couple of shutout games, when you've got a quick turnaround to the Boston College game after the new year, that's a good step. And if they can make some noise against BC on January 4th, not necessarily win the game, but make noise, again, you can start to see this team start to press forward and maybe try to claw up and get home ice in that first round, which going up there's a very tough place to play.
It was also the first college hockey games in 20 years in Southern California, not since the 1999 Frozen Four in Anaheim, as Harvard had a couple of home games against Arizona State in the SoCal clash between Arizona State and Harvard. A 4-1 win for the Crimson on the first night, a 4-4 tie on the second night. Two pretty well-matched teams. And, Jim and I have been talking how Arizona State is a good team, a very good team perhaps, but maybe not an elite team. And the results from that weekend show that the Sun Devils are going to have to continue to put a few victories behind them, maybe get another 11 or 12 wins in the second half of the season to cement themselves a position for the postseason. But Arizona State probably a better team this year than a lot of people thought.
Yes, I would agree with that. The difference for Arizona State is that the strength of schedule is a little bit different. They're maybe a better team, but they're going to play some teams that they simply can't lose to. They lost the 2 games to Minnesota State, and I think if they win one of those games, we're looking at them a little bit differently. If they don't lose the overtime game to Michigan State, and there's no shame in losing to some of these teams that is mentioning them. But I think this past weekend, the games against Harvard are going to be games that Arizona State looks back on, and those are the games that they really needed to win because they're punching at about the same strength level as Harvard right now. I think they were right next to each other in the polls, both the USCHO.com poll and the PairWise. The losing and tying that game and that 4-4 tie, when I look at that, the fact that they at least were able to come back from down 3-0, but the fact that happened to them is going to hurt because you look at the second half of the schedule for Arizona State, and there's a lot of Atlantic hockey teams on there. And as much as I hate to say it about my own league, you can't lose those games, and that's going to hurt them down the stretch. So I think they're a better team regardless of what the record says. I do think they need to go out and make some statements in the second half of the season, and we'll see if they're a better Arizona State team than last year maybe holds true because they're not sneaking up on anybody after last year.
Well, that's certainly true. One team that may be sneaking up on some people, certainly sneaking up on the consciences of the voters around the country, is Army. Army at 13-5-1. 3 of those wins are non-conference, Union, UConn early in the season, and then a win 5-4 over UNH this past weekend. Army is at number 20 in the PairWise and is at number 20 in the USCHO.com poll. We both see quite a bit of Army. We saw last year a team that got decimated by injuries. Trevin Kozlowski has been stellar in net, and Coach Brian Riley has a team that may be making some noise in the postseason. They're certainly going to be right up there in Atlantic hockey's postseason play.
Well, I fear Army. I mean, that's as clear cut as I can put it. The last couple of years, when I've watched an Army Black Knight team, I have looked at them and I've seen a well-coached team that fits the bill of when you say Army, right? They're tough, physical, disciplined, can endure anything that's thrown at them. They don't get tired on long shifts. They'll be out there. They'll wait for their break and then they'll go, and they just don't ever seem to let up. And in past years, that's been to their detriment when they've been injured because they aren't able to get the clear outs when we're talking about them, right? You're saying, well, they don't get tired on 2-minute shifts on a penalty kill, but 1, they're on a penalty kill, and 2, they're on the ice for 2 minutes. This year, as I'm saying that, it's more of a positive because they're playing with leads when that happens. They know how to turn it back and put it in transition, and they're a team that I'm waiting for more people to take note of, and I'm going to get myself in trouble when I say this with a lot of fans when I say, if I were to put a team down on paper that is undefeated in non-league play, that is 13-5-1, is 10-5-1 in its conference, how they're only ranked 20th, I'll never know. And maybe that changes after the Fortress Invitational when they go out to Las Vegas, if they can make noise against Providence and then either Cornell or Ohio State. If they play both of those games well, maybe people will buy in stock on them. But the fact that they had to replace Sacred Heart in the rankings essentially as the number 20 team, and you're looking at that record with what they've accomplished. They beat Union. They beat Connecticut. We're not talking about elite number 1 Cornell type teams, at least not yet. But beating New Hampshire, I think more people need to take note of Army because they do well on January 3rd and 4th, and Army's in the at-large bid conversation. So it's not surprising us. I'll say that. It's not surprising us, but people shouldn't be surprised if something happens out in Vegas.
Yeah, and it was interesting just talking to Brian Riley a few weeks ago. He was talking about, 3 ranked teams plus us, Army. Well, now it's 4 ranked teams. Number 2, Cornell. Number 14, Providence. And number 6, Ohio State in that tournament. And later on in the week, Jim Conley and I will preview that tournament on the Game of the Week podcast. We're going to take a pause, and we're going to take a look when we come back at the standings in the different leagues, who's hot, who's not, and a quick look at the PairWise when we continue. This episode is brought to you by the 2020 NCAA Frozen 4, April 9th and 11th in Detroit, Michigan. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online.
Every time you show up, every time you make your presence heard, whether you clap your hands or stomp your feet, lead the chant or join the chorus. However you choose to be a fan, you make the game. The NCAA Frozen 4, April 9th and 11th at Little Caesars Arena in Detroit. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 to get your tickets today.
Continuing with the USCHO.com Weekend Review podcast, I'm Ed Trefzger with guest co-host Dan Rubin. Dan, let's take a quick survey of where teams are in the standings right now at the middle of the season and what things look like. I guess we'll go in alphabetical order. We did this a little bit with the podcast that'll air a little bit later today with Brad Schlossman from the Grand Forks Herald with the NCHC. But let's start with Atlantic Hockey. Every year it comes down to the last weekend of the season for standings and who gets the first round bye. This year, an extra wrinkle with the 3-on-3 and the shootout, meaning wins are worth 3 points, a tie a tie in regulation and then an overtime point in 3-on-3 may be the difference in standings. And right now, it looks like it's anybody's league to win. Is there somebody who has an opportunity here, or somebody has a leg up?
I can't wait to break out my abacus at the Bentley Holy Cross game and try to figure out what the scenarios are on that last week, and that's gonna be great. I think Sacred Heart and Army, if somebody doesn't catch them, they could. I mean, they've already got 7-8 points, which I know is only 2 or 3 games in Atlantic hockey speak, but they're starting to break away. And if someone doesn't catch them in the first part of the year, that's going to sew up 2 spots. But behind that, I would fear RIT in that 5th spot if I were AIC or Robert Morris. It's good to see AIC get its legs back under it after the start of the year, and Robert Morris is always around. But to see RIT sitting there at 5th, that's something that scares me as the second half starts, because that's a good team. And there are other teams that have underperformed in Atlantic hockey that are back in 7th and 8th. I'm looking even at my own beloved Bentley Falcons in that respect. Second place last year, came out, have dealt with inconsistency this year. If consistency strikes for any of those teams, Bentley, Niagara, even Air Force in 6th, that 3rd spot, the AIC Robert Morris RIT spot, 3, 4, 5, are going to come under fire. And I think you're right. It's easy to sit here and say, well, this is going to happen in January, but come the end of February, me and my trusty abacus, and I'm going to look at the tea leaves and the I Ching and every other thing that I can come up with and see what I can find in the biblical sense to formulate a thought for Atlantic Hockey.
As we look to the Big Ten, Penn State has kind of opened up a lead. If you'd asked me at the end of October, I would have said, well, it looks like Notre Dame's going to run away with it. But then they had a 6-game losing streak. Penn State has opened up a 5-point lead. Guy Godowski says if his team can play a little better on defense, that's what they need, because they're an offensive juggernaut, putting up the last few seasons, putting up about 40 shots a game, shooting from the popcorn stand. But I think the real surprise in the Big Ten for me, a team that was close in a lot of games last year and is finding ways to win them, is Michigan State.
Stole the words out of my mouth. I love Michigan State. I was very much pro Michigan State last year, even though they obviously didn't win a ton of games in comparison to some of the other teams that they saw. But I really, the more I looked at them, and I looked at them because of Taro Hirose in the Hobie Baker race, and the fact that I really wanted to vote for Taro, and I think I actually did on my ballot in some capacity. But when I was looking at Michigan State as a team, right, they actually didn't seem that bad, and to see them have a breakout this year and to see what Michigan State can do this year has been a long time coming for them. So can they pressure Penn State? We'll find out. Ohio State seems to be a step behind Penn State. So as things are lining up, if Michigan State can keep pace, it's going to make for an exciting run in the Big Ten down the home stretch.
When we look at the ECAC, 4 teams have kind of bubbled to the top. We talked about Dartmouth being close and right in there. Cornell and Clarkson, probably the cream of that league, and Harvard not far behind. But surprising in the standings to a lot of people might be Colgate. They're 5-2-1 in conference, though they've gone 2-7-3 outside of the ECAC.
Yeah, Colgate has not made any sense to me. I follow a lot of ECAC, doing some work with Brown. They really have not made sense to me. They're a team that lost to Boston College, lost to Miami, lost to Brown 4-1, a game that I watched on my trusty tablet. But they've come back down the stretch, won 4 out of 5 at one point. They just got swept out of Ohio State. But I thought that Dartmouth and Harvard weekend was such a big weekend for them. Picking up the win against Princeton and Belfast certainly helps them. And 5-2. There's always one ECAC team that seems to be one of these things is not like the others in that top 4 or top 5. And it looks like Colgate is going to start the second half of that year. They have a little bit of a tough run in the second half. They have to go to Quinnipiac. They have to go to Cornell. They actually have to play their travel partner over that weekend, the Cornell Colgate weekend, home and home. They have to play them twice. And then they have a road trip. Once they get through that, they only have one road trip in February. So as the month ends, we'll see if Colgate's for real in that league, and we'll see what happens with them moving forward.
When we look at Hockey East, if you just look at the points in the league, you'd see Boston College mired at 6th place, but they've got a lot of games in hand and the best winning percentage. They've got some good freshmen. They've got an upper class that is contributing, and Spencer Knight in net. Is Boston College the odds-on favorite in Hockey East?
I think you have to consider it until someone else says otherwise. UMass is a good team this year. UMass is missing something that they had last year, and I'm not just saying that because it's Cale Makar. But UMass is missing that. They went to when you lose the national championship game, coming back is so much more difficult. So UMass is kind of missing that same little edge that they had last year, that little extra edge. Very good team. I don't want anyone to say I'm taking that away from them. It's the same thing that Northeastern is running into, where Northeastern is a very good team, but they're just kind of missing that one extra edge. BC has that edge. I think BC is tired of looking at, we haven't been to the tournament in Chestnut Hill, haven't won Bean Pots, we haven't done the things that everybody thinks of Boston College hockey. And I think Boston College, for all of its talent, has finally laid the hammer down and said, look, guys, we're back. And for Boston College, 5-2 in league, 11-4 overall, they have all those games in hand. They're going to make some noise. And come February, when the Bean Pot strikes out here, I'm really thinking that we're going to be looking at this as a 2 or 3 horse race for that number 1 team in the country between North Dakota, Cornell, and Boston College.
When we look out west of the NCHC, we'll hear some more about that with the conversation with Brad Schlossman talking about the NCHC in our Spotlight podcast. But North Dakota and Minnesota Duluth have opened up a little bit of space in conference. Duluth just 5-5 out of conference, but 6-1-1 in conference. Denver and Western Michigan and St. Cloud lurking behind. You can't look past any of them. As we had in our conversation with Brad Schlossman, Western Michigan has had a lot of injuries. St. Cloud, we knew this was going to be a rebuilding year. And then you look at not too far behind Miami, Colorado College, and Omaha, that if they get hot can make some noise. This seems like the most wide open NCHC since the league started to me.
Yeah, and we know whoever wins this is probably just going to win the national championship, right? I mean, that's what happens.
Just award it then, and just, right?
Yeah, whoever wins this league is going to win the national title, right? Isn't that what happens? I mean, that's what I've seen happen in the last few years. But no, I think the team to watch there, Brad talks about this, and I don't want to give away too much, is Western Michigan. North Dakota is obviously a certified wagon at this point. Minnesota Duluth, the defending national champions a couple times over. Denver's been to the Frozen Four. So, hey, someone's going to come out of this league, and it doesn't matter who's in 4th place or 5th place. St. Cloud was the number 1 overall seed last year, and they're number 5 in the league right now. They're in 5th place. So, I mean, it's the NCHC. This league's going to be awesome to watch just because these teams are on a completely other planet than everyone else right now. Until someone else wins the national title, I'm saying the NCHC is on a completely other planet.
Minnesota State may speak to that in the WCHA. They want to get an NCAA win finally. They're 0-6, I think the number is, in NCAA play. They are at 10-2 in conference, 16-3 and 1 overall. So they've got a 5-point lead in the WCHA. Bemidji State, Michigan Tech, and Bowling Green, all teams that we expected to be in the hunt. But look, there's Alaska in a tie for third place with Michigan Tech at 8-6 overall in the conference. That should be a fun second half of the season in the WCHA's penultimate season.
And look, it's the elephant in the room, so I'm going to mention it, which is, Alaska is, whether or not you agree with what's happening in the WCHA with those teams looking to leave essentially the Alaska schools and Alabama Huntsville behind. This is still a competitive league at its top. I think Minnesota State is obviously an elite level team. Bemidji State, maybe a step behind them or is a step behind them, still very good, but, not that number one caliber team. They just don't have that certain something that you look at and see a number one team. That makes the race behind Minnesota State more wide open as the second half starts. And as an outside, look, I've always had an affinity for the Alaska schools, for the Pacific Northwest like that, the Great Northwest or whatever. The last frontier, the Arctic Circle, whatever I want to call it. To see Fairbanks in the mix, you kind of have to feel good about that, and I think it would go a long way to make for a good second half storyline. To see Alaska challenge these teams, to see what can happen in this league, because only a couple games separate Minnesota State, who again is on another stratosphere right now, playing great hockey, is the only team to beat North Dakota this year. But those other teams are right behind them in the conference. So as the second half starts, I'm really interested to see what happens there. And I think it'll make for a great story if Alaska is part of it and part of that run. And I know for what everything's been happening, I root on every team, but there's that little something that does want to see Alaska maybe galvanize itself a little bit with this run.
Well, let's take a quick look at the PairWise. We promised we'd do that. Towards the end of January, it really starts to gel, and you can kind of make some pretty solid predictions on who is going to make it to the postseason tournament, no matter what. The top four teams right now are pretty solid unless there's a complete collapse for North Dakota, Cornell, Minnesota State, and Boston College. When you get into the next little bit, then you've got to have teams that got to continue to do well. And you look at Denver, Penn State, Ohio State, Clarkson, UMass, and Minnesota Duluth. Those are pretty likely for the national tournament, but they've got to keep things rolling. We've been concerned a little bit on the national scene with Minnesota Duluth, but it seems like things have turned around there. Anybody in that bunch that you think is in some danger, or these all look like pretty solid teams?
I think they're pretty solid. I think when you're number one seed last year, and I'm looking namely at UMass, and I'm looking at Minnesota Duluth too in this regard, when you're a team that you just need to stay comfortable. You need to stay in that comfortable slot where you can feel good about your chances. And I think they can feel good with their record. They can't slip up, but I also think those are teams that, with a winning pedigree now, with a winning resume, the teams that went to the national championship last year, they know how to win. And so if they need to reach back and get a win over the right teams, they're going to find their way in. They might not be on the same caliber as a number one seed, a North Dakota, Cornell this year, my predictive Boston College team. But at the same time, these are teams that you can expect will stick around. And I think barring a collapse in January or February, will stick around and filter into those number two seeds and possibly make some noise when the tournament starts.
Then you looked at the next band, UMass Lowell, Northeastern Providence, 3 Hockey East teams, Notre Dame behind them, Harvard and Arizona State. Those teams in Hockey East are going to need to go deep in that league's tournament to keep in that position and have to be solid in the regular season. Notre Dame, after that slump in November, really has to watch out. And Arizona State, with picking up 1 out of 4 points essentially against Harvard, dropped from the top 10 to number 16. Arizona State right now, right on the bubble. Jim and I have talked about how really you need to get around 21 wins to be sure to get in the tournament. Arizona State definitely, as we were talking about earlier in the podcast, is going to have to take care of business at that position.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, the loss to Harvard and the tie against Harvard really hurts, because you look at the second half that's facing both of those teams, and Harvard's going to have its conference schedule. They play Cornell. They play those teams that are like that. They get a chance to play those top tier teams in ECAC. They also have the Beanpot, and that means they're going to play Northeastern. And they're going to play Boston College potentially. Boston University is also in there. But assuming that they get 2 games potentially against Northeastern and Boston College, Harvard has the upper hand there, because those are 2 teams that they're either jostling with for positioning, or potentially with BC getting a game-changing win. BU also being a team that if they were to play, they simply can't lose that game. BU is all the way down in the 30s in the pairwise. Arizona State, which doesn't have the benefit of a conference schedule, which can pull it along, and in this regard, which last year helped it, and this year playing a lot of games against teams that are down the bottom in the pairwise. They get 2 games out at Brown, where I know Brown has struggled this year, despite my preseason sleeper prognostication. They're going to play a bunch of Atlantic hockey teams, including Holy Cross, who is struggling to start the year, and an inconsistent Bentley team. They play 2 games against Alaska Anchorage, who is a bottom team right now in the WCHA. They can't lose any of these games, and even then, it might not help them. So you're right about the 21, 20-plus win plateau, but Arizona State is in some trouble to start the second half of the year, because if Harvard or teams beat teams that are perceived as better by the numbers, Arizona State could win all these games, and it still might not matter for them, unfortunately.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for the Weekend Review podcast for December 31st, 2019. This podcast episode has been brought to you by the 2020 NCAA Frozen Four, April 9th and 11th in Detroit, Michigan. For tickets, visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. For guest host Dan Rubin, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll see you in 2020.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.